So to get started, you're going to need a board that's about 7/8 inches thick, and then you're going to rip a 30mm stick off of that, get it all cleaned up. And then you're going to cut an 8 to 10 inch piece off one end, and we'll glue it back to itself to thicken up that end that's going to eventually be the headstock. We're going to do that so that we can cut a nice angle out of this and have an angled headstock. So here we are cutting an angle. I went ahead and cut the top first, and then making sure you still have about at least a 1/2 inch of a headstock there, you go ahead and flip it around and cut the back. I left a little meat on here, partially for strength and partially as a design element. We'll clean that up later. Okay, next up is marking the positions of the frets. You're going to want to use an online fret calculator, print out the location of each fret, get a good straight edge and a marking tool, and go down marking each fret along the fretboard. I've gotten a little tired of this method, so I've done something a little different this time. I disassembled an old 3D printer and built this. We've got our fret lines marked out, and don't worry about my squished indicators here. I'm going to sand those off in a minute. But now we need to go ahead and cut our fret slots. And the way you typically do that is with a saw that's 0.023 inches wide. And you just go down here making sure the saw is perfectly aligned. It's very important that you don't get one way or the other. And I got a little tired of doing it this way once again, and so I made another weird tool. This is a teeny tiny table saw basically, and it runs on some tiny little Harbor Freight cutoff saw that I found, and it has a little 2-inch blade in there, and it just so happens to be about the right size for a fret slot. So I'm going to use a sled on here that slides back and forth, and I'll be able to place my neck in here and just chop out each of these real quick. If you've been paying attention, you'll see that I actually marked my frets on the back of the neck instead of the front like you would. And the reason for that is then I'll be able to line those lines up with the line on the saw and make the cuts on the correct front side. So once we have our fret lines cut, what we're going to do next is measure from where the nut will be down the scale length of your instrument. So mine I did about 24.5. So I'm going to measure down and mark a spot 24.5. And then I want that spot to be about halfway in the middle of this can. So I'm going to put the can about there and then mark where the can would start, and then we're going to make a cut right there. Okay, now that we've got that cut off, we're going to glue an extra little bit on here. And put this on like that. I've already got a little radius cut there. And the reason we're doing this is we want this can to sit slightly below this surface. So you could maybe just notch out what we already had there, but I'm going to do it this way where you cut it and re-glue onto here so that this can sit right about there. The next part is going to be adding some wings on the side here, which I've got these ready. And the thought of these is they're going to go inside the can and press up against the walls on the top and bottom here. And hopefully they'll be able to go in sideways and then turn to be right along the edges here. So I've got these prepared. I'm going to go ahead and get these glued on. Okay, so last time I did this, I had this little extra bit peeking out of a hole that I cut in here. And then the strings went through some holes that I drilled in this wood and came up through the bottom and up over the top. I think this time I'm going to just change things up a little bit. I've got this piece of aluminum flat bar. I drilled a few holes through, cut off a piece and bent this out. And I think I might just attach this right here instead of going through it. Next up, we need to place our tuners on here in the arrangement that you want. And we'll get those marked out in certain locations and then drill the holes out. I decided to put a little bit of zebra wood on top of this just for the heck of it to make it look prettier. Next up, time to start rounding over the back. It feels super weird to have these fret lines on here. But remember, that was just for the alignment of the saw. So I left this extra little bump here. I'm going to try to mark out a rough curve on it. And I'm going to try to carve a little bit of a volute on here. Alright, I think that turned out pretty good. Just gives you a nice place to rest your hand when you're down at the end of the fretboard. It's time for some frets. I buy this fret wire that's straight and flat. I use cutoffs to trim one of the edges at a slight angle, set it in the fret slot, figure out exactly where I need to trim it, and then I use a tool like this to actually cut the fret and then insert it in there. After you tap each fret in with a hammer, you'll find that the ends are super sharp that stick out a little bit. And so we need to clean those up. But first I'd like to tape down anything that I don't want to get scratched up. And then I'll grab a file and go ahead and clean up those fret ends. It's a pretty essential step to making the instrument playable. And the next step is to level the frets. Some of them are probably going to be a little higher than others, especially if you're whacking them in with a hammer like I was doing. So what we can do is use a Sharpie and mark on the top of each fret, and then I have some sandpaper taped down to a surface that I know to be flat, and then we'll just run this along the sandpaper, and you'll see any frets that are low will still be black, and the ones that are high will be scraped off immediately. And you just want to do that till they're all even. So down here you can see that this fret is all scraped off and clean, and these two are still black from the Sharpie. So that means this one was sitting high, and we're going to level that down to be the same as these. And then once we're all done, we'll go ahead and hit those with a buffing wheel and a buffing pad and clean the frets back up. So we used multiple files, multiple sanding pads, and some steel wool, and eventually a buffing wheel on my drill, and I think it's looking good enough. Hey, it's looking nice. At this point, the stick part is pretty much done. I've got my logo on there, we've got fret markers, added this little guy just for fun. So I'm going to go ahead and start adding some finish. I'm just going to be using some wipe-on poly at first, and we'll see how that goes. This is a pretty fun part because sometimes that grain just really pops out and looks beautiful. Check that out. Got these pre-drilled. I'll go ahead and get this on here. So you gotta kind of put it in at an angle and then twist it into place. And see if we can't line up the holes here. That looks pretty good. Now that the can is secured back here, you can still see it's got some freedom of movement this way. So we just need to sink a screw here and here, and that'll lock it in. We'll go ahead and get our tuners added on here. One last piece we're missing here is a bridge, which we can make out of some hardwood. And we'll just use some files to make some indentations for the strings to sit in. Now you may need to do a little experimentation, but these are the strings I'm going to use on this instrument. I'm going to go ahead and get these added in here and see how it works. I ran into a slight problem on this. This bridge that I made sat about down here, and when the strings came through it, they were resting on this edge, and it was causing it to bend in. So I'm going to take this off, and I made a larger one, which is going to sit higher, and hopefully most of the tension will be on the bridge itself and not on the tin. Adding a pickup to this type of instrument is very easy. If you're going to go with the normal electric guitar pickup, I would suggest one with rails configuration so that you don't have to worry about pole pieces aligning with the odd number of strings you have. I'm actually going to use something different. It's a piezo pickup. It's a small little crystal in here that transmits sound through vibration. So you're not worrying about electromagnetism. This is just stuck on somewhere inside here, and it'll pick up the vibrations and send it down to this output jack, which I'm going to solder on here. I have the piezo mounted to the back of the can right now, and we've got it plugged in here. I'm going to go ahead and turn this little practice amp on. Let's see what we got.